Welcome, everyone. You are in the EPA Grants Award Process webinar. And before we get started, I wanted to review a few housekeeping tips, just so everyone is aware of how the webinar is going to go and how you can use your controls if you're unfamiliar with this webinar format. The first thing you should do is you should maximize your browser window to make sure that you can see all the controls. And your audio is controlled by the device you're using to join the webinar, for example, your desktop computer or your tablet. If you're experiencing any trouble with the sound or audio, please turn up the volume of the device you're using and make sure your device is not muted. If you do have audio issues or want to watch the presentation again, a recording of today's webinar will be made available on the EPA Grants Award Process webinar website. You can click the link on this slide to access that web page. And it will be on future slides as well. We're using the Microsoft Teams webinar platform, and in order to limit background noise, your microphone and camera will be disabled for the duration of the webinar. However, you can engage with the speakers by sending in questions to the link provided in the green box on this slide. It will also be present on each presentation slide. And you can use emojis to react to the presenters during the webinar. For example, you can use the thumbs up or clapping hands or smiley face emojis if you hear something you like. The chat pane on the right should be used for technical issues only. The moderators will be using the chat pane to send answers to the submitted questions and other general information about the webinar. Please keep your chat pane open so you don't miss anything. This webinar will be conducted in English, but you can choose to translate the slides into several other languages. Below the slides, you'll click on the ellipsis to show the Translate Slides button and then scroll through the language options and choose your preferred language. Please note that the translation is automatically generated and will not be 100% accurate, and not all languages are available. Participants are also able to view a live transcript of the webinar as well as closed captioned, and both will be in English. If you want to do this, at the top right of your screen, click the ellipses to show a long drop-down menu, and then you'll click Show Transcript to view a live transcript of the webinar, or choose Turn on Live Captions to view live captions at the bottom of your screen. Okay, this is the EPA Grants Award Process webinar, and we have today with us two presenters. The first to present will be Bruce Binder, who's the Senior Associate Director for Grants Competition and the Acting Deputy Office Director for the Office of Grants and Debarment. I will also be giving a presentation. My name is Elizabeth January, and I'm the Acting Grants Competition Advocate for the Office of Grants and Debarment. Also with us today are Kathy McGurl and Emma Eichelman, contractors that will be helping us facilitate this presentation. So you may see them in the chat box helping you out with technical issues or providing answers to the questions that you're submitting. Now, before we get started into the webinar, we're going to put a couple of poll questions up. They are completely voluntary. You do not need to answer them, but they can give us an idea of the type of audience that we have, and it can help us tailor our presentation a little bit. And it just helps us get to know you. So we'll take a few minutes so you guys can answer those two questions if you choose, and then we'll get started. So I'm going to give you guys a few background pieces of information that are just good to know, and I like to do them up front in case people need to drop off the webinar or miss some things due to technical issues. The first thing I want to point out to you is the EPA Grants Update Listserv. This is a really useful listserv, and we encourage you to sign up. Hopefully you're already signed up, but if you're not, you can click on that link on the slide, and that will take you to a forms page that you can just sign up with your email address. We don't send a ton of notifications out through this listserv. We only send important information like a new webinar or training that might be available, new guidance, changes in grants management requirements. Now, these are all general updates. They wouldn't be specific to any one grant. So if you have a grant with EPA, you would receive updates about that grant a separate way. But if you want to receive general information, this is a great place to sign up. I mentioned training. We have a grants management training that's relatively new, and it takes you through the cradle to grave of managing a grant. It's a really great training that's broken up into 6 modules. You don't have to sit through 6 modules all at once. You can take it whenever you want. It's self-guided, and it's, you know, very interactive. There are quizzes. There's a link at the bottom of the page that will take you to it. You can bookmark it. I highly recommend taking it. And even if you've taken it already, it's always a good idea to take it, you know, annually to refresh on some of the topics that you might become rusty in. We also have a training on developing a budget. This one's really popular. A lot of people find developing a budget to raise a lot of questions and can be challenging for them. This is a very in-depth training on developing a budget. I highly recommend it. Please bookmark it if you haven't taken it already. Also, I want to make sure you're aware we do have COVID-19 grant flexibilities still in place. We have a what we call a RAIN out there. It's basically an external policy notification, and that describes what flexibilities are available. So if you do have an EPA grant or you're thinking about getting one, it's good to be familiar with those flexibilities. Lastly, this isn't so much a new update, but if you haven't been in the grants world for a year or two, it might be new to you. There are updates to 2 CFR 200. A majority of them went into effect almost a year ago in November of 2020, but we did have some that went into effect in August of 2020. Somewhat more recent, I guess. If you want to read the details on those, we do have that RAIN that you can click on that goes into details, because it sometimes is difficult for people to determine what those updates are from the regulations themselves. Also, I want to make sure you're aware of a change that's currently in process, and it's changing the unique identifier that identifies organizations to the federal government from the DUNS to the UEI. Currently, you must have a DUNS to register in sam.gov and to get grants with EPA. But as of May 2021, SAM started issuing UEIs, unique entity identifiers that are generated by sam.gov itself. So anybody with a DUNS number will be getting a UEI. And by April 2022, the DUNS number will be completely phased out and you will need to have a UEI. If you're not currently registered in SAM and don't have a DUNS number, you don't have to worry, but when you do register, you'll need to get a UEI. And we have a RAIN document that's linked to on the slide that gives you more information about how EPA is transitioning. It gives more details about how that works, and we will be issuing additional guidance as new information unfolds. Well, that brings us to the end of our little updates at the beginning. Now I would like to turn it over to Bruce Binder to go over our competition slides. He is our Senior Associate Director for Grants Competition here in the Office of Grants and Debarment. Bruce?
Thanks, Liz. And I've noticed a bunch of messages on the top of people are still trying to get in. I think there's just it's a high volume, so it may be taking longer for people when they're waiting in the lobby. I know there was some.
Bruce, we do have facilitators working on getting all those people in, so I think we can just continue with the presentation, okay, and they'll handle that. Thanks.
Okay. So as Liz said, we're happy that you all joined us. We have a high attendance for this, which is great. It shows a lot of interest in the EPA programs. And I'll be just giving an overview of the competition program at EPA. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them, as Liz indicated in the intro. And even after that, if anything comes up, you can always reach Liz or myself with any questions.
Bruce, just hold on 1 minute. We are having a little bit of technical issue, so okay. Wait 1 moment. Please be patient with us, everybody. This is a brand new platform we haven't used before, and we got wonderful turnout. We're so glad that so many of you are joining us, but it is creating a bit of a lag over here. So we'll pause for now. And again, this entire webinar will be available recorded on our website, hopefully later this week. And we'll be sending out an update to the listserv with that recording link. So if you're signed up to the listserv or you become signed up to it after this, you'll get an update if for some reason you aren't able to participate fully in the webinar. Okay, looks like we're getting to the tail end. I think everybody, for the most part, that is trying to get in is here. For those of you who missed the first few minutes of this webinar, we are going to be sending out a link via our listserv, and I will put that page right back up on the screen for people that were not with us at the beginning. There is a link on this page. If you clicked, or I should say on this slide, if you click on it, you can join our listserv, and we will be sending out a recording of this webinar to everybody on that listserv. So if you missed the beginning of this presentation, you'll be able to catch it when we send out that recording. And of course, you can share that recording with anyone that you think might be interested that wasn't able to attend today. I'll leave that up for a minute or two. And this link also will be showing up periodically in our webinar. We do mention it again, so you will have another opportunity to click on it. Appreciate your patience, all of you who've been waiting. And I do see we have some questions. In case you missed that part of the presentation, let me go back and get to this slide at the bottom. You'll see this link. It's a forms.office.com link. If you click on that, you'll be able to send any questions that you have for us regarding the presentations we're given. If you put it in the chat box, it will likely get lost. So please use the forms link, and that forms link will be present on every slide of our main presentation. So you'll have an opportunity to click on it along the way, send in your questions, and we will be responding to those questions in the chat box. And please make sure your chat pane is open so you can see those updates. Okay. All right. Well, I think we have waited long enough. I'm going to bring it back to the competition presentation and hand it over to Bruce Binder, our Senior Associate Director for Grants Competition in the Office of Grants and Debarment, and he will be telling us all about competitive grants and applying for them at EPA. Thank you, Bruce.
Thanks, Liz. And again, we apologize for the technical issues. We used a different platform today because of the overwhelming response, because the prior technology we used had very low limits. So again, we appreciate your patience. I'm just going to give an overview of the competitive process at EPA. Feel free to ask questions whenever you want. We'll answer as many as we can, and if we can't answer them during this webinar, we'll answer them afterwards. You know, again, we hope that you find this informative, and you know, we welcome your interest in EPA programs. The first thing you just wanted to is, you know, if you're interested in competing for an EPA program, then, you know, the question is, how do you find the opportunities? And all the opportunities, the competitive opportunities at EPA, are posted on grants.gov, which is the government-wide clearinghouse for all agencies are supposed to post their opportunities for people to compete for. On grants.gov, and we'll show some slides on that later, you know, each opportunity has what's called a synopsis, which is a summary of the opportunity that highlights key information about, you know, the amount of money that we have to compete, who's eligible, the submission deadline, and other information. In addition, on grants.gov, you could search by assistance listing number, which used to be called the CFDA number. That stands for Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance. If you're interested in opportunities under a particular CFDA, you could set up search parameters that whenever there's an opportunity under that CFDA, you would get notified of it. In addition, we have what at EPA is called discretionary competitive programs. There are programs based on the Office of Management and Budget definition. Programs are defined as either discretionary or non-discretionary. And a discretionary program is where an agency like EPA has the ability to determine who is getting the funds and how much they are. So, you know, I guess it's just self-explanatory. There is some discretion in who gets the awards and the nature of the work and the amount of money. Non-discretionary programs are those where there really is just a formula or an allotment, and we just have to give the money based on that there's no ability or to exercise any discretion. All competitive opportunities by definition are discretionary because people have to compete. We don't know who's going to get the awards or the exact amount sometimes. So those are discretionary. And at this link, if you wanted to just look at all the discretionary programs, they're listed there. There are also some non-competitive programs that are technically discretionary based on the definition by the Office of Management and Budget, because even though we don't compete them, those programs generally have some flexibility in the award amount, even though they're not competed. Again, and we'll show this later, if you're interested in any government agency's opportunities, you could sign up on grants.gov to get automatic notifications whenever an opportunity is posted. At EPA, except in very limited circumstances, if you apply for an EPA grant, whether it's competitive or non-competitive, you have to apply online through grants.gov for the initial submittal. And what we mean by that is, you know, when you apply for the initial grant, you do it electronically through grants.gov. Sometimes, after, especially for competitive opportunities, after you submit your application and it's evaluated, we sometimes have to ask for some additional information from applicants. When that happens, that information is not submitted through grants.gov. It could be submitted through email or other means. So the requirement for grants.gov is from the initial submittal. In addition, to apply through grants.gov, you have to meet certain prerequisites. And that includes you have to be registered and have a DUNS number. As Liz said, that will be changing to a unique identity identifier in the future. You have to be registered with SAM, which is the System for Award Management, and you also have to be registered in grants.gov. And in grants.gov, you have to have what's called an authorized organization representative, who's the person who would submit your materials to grants.gov. The main thing is that if you're interested in EPA opportunities or any government agency's opportunities, you need to make sure the registration requirements are met in advance of the deadline for that opportunity. Because if you wait to the last minute, many times there are issues and that can't be resolved by the submission deadline, and then you won't. Then if you're late, you won't lose the ability to get an award under that opportunity. So if you're not already registered, you should register as soon as possible. Whether there's an opportunity you want to compete for now or not, it's always prudent to be registered because it will save you time later. When you apply through grants.gov, you have to use what's called Workspace, which is their format and platform for submitting your narrative and your application materials. We don't want to go into all the detail about that. Grants.gov has a lot of information about how to use the system, how to apply. They have a help desk that I think is open to 24/7 or has very long hours, so they're always there to help people who have issues with applying. And the next few slides just will show kind of a depiction of grants.gov, what the page looks like. This is the home page, and on the top, home, learn grants, search grants. I mean, search grants is what you would look at. I think it's on the next slide when you're trying to just find opportunities. If applicants, if you clicked on that, that then provides you step-by-step instructions of how to register at grants.gov. Grantors is really for like the government agencies like EPA. That's like where we go on to it and post the opportunities and the application things. And again, support, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of resources. Grants.gov is a very useful resource. And again, the help desk is always available and always has been very helpful to people who have experienced issues. Again, this is, if you wanted to search a grant, if you see in the left-hand column, you could search by different parameters, by grant, by cooperative agreement. A grant and cooperative agreement are what are called forms of assistance agreements as opposed to a contract. Sometimes people just use the word grant synonymously with cooperative agreement, but they're different in that under a cooperative agreement, the agency has more involvement with the performance of the award, unlike under a grant where the agency is not really involved as much. So that's the key difference. Again, you could search by all these different parameters, all these categories, and then you could also search by agency. And if you're interested, all agencies, you would click that. But if you're interested in a particular agency, then you would just pick that agency, like EPA is one of them. And then this slide, again, the support function is where if you had questions, you could go there. Manage subscriptions, which will be the next slide I show you. That's a really neat feature that in grants.gov, you could set up automatic notifications where you want to get a notice every time a new opportunity is posted by an agency. You could set that up where you'll get an email. Or if you want to narrow that by certain parameters, by just certain agencies or certain assistance listings, you could do that too. So we really encourage people to sign up for this feature, because that will make it easier than having to go search on grants.gov every day or however often you wanna. You would automatically get emails when an opportunity was posted by an agency that could be of interest to you or that met the criteria that you set to be notified. So we really encourage you to sign up for this feature in grants.gov. So that's basically a grants.gov. Prima. It's a great website. It's what all the government uses. All of our opportunities are posted there, and you have to apply through grants.gov. And it's really probably worth spending some time searching and exploring the system, because it really has a wealth of information. In addition to posting our opportunities on grants.gov, sometimes the program office and the EPA, the Office of Air, Office of Water, they sometimes post their opportunities on their websites also. It's not a requirement. It really just supplements what's posted on grants.gov. But sometimes people, search through EPA's websites, and this is just another means to make our announcements available to people. Another term, when I mentioned earlier, is the assistance listings and the catalog of federal domestic assistance. That's really an encyclopedia of all government-wide grant programs. Every agency is there. There'll be the next few pages I'll show you. There'll be, there's a listing for each separate program that has some basic information about the program that could help educate people who are unfamiliar with it about the program, what type of projects are awarded under it, historically how much funding has been made under it, and other information specific to that program. And this is just a typical one. This is just what it looks like in the assistance listing on sam.gov. If you wanted to search like for EPA or something, you would put in a search term. You could also just go, there's a way you could just go to EPA and see all of our programs. I think right now we have about 103 programs. And here's just a typical entry in the assistance listing for this program. And then you'll see on the left, each program is populated by certain information in different sections. There's an overview, there's the criteria for applying. For the competitive programs, it's really just general information in these sections, because the information that applies to each competition would be set forth in the solicitation that's issued. not necessarily in this document, which is more of a general overview of each of our programs. But again, there is, again, for someone who's unfamiliar with our programs or any government agency's program, the CFDA is a great resource to begin with to learn about the programs and learn about the different grants that agencies award. Other resources that are available in addition to grants.gov and the assistance listings, we have a page, an internet page at EPA with competition information. It has information about our competition policy, and I also believe there's also information about the awards that we've made in the past under competitions going back for 4 or 5 years. So if you were interested to see who got awards under prior competitions, that information is available, like I said, at least for the last couple of years. Grants.gov, as we said, has a ton of resources of how to use grants.gov, how to register, and how to apply through grants.gov. So again, if you're unfamiliar with grants.gov, we encourage you to go to the grants.gov website and look at the materials that they have there. The next bunch of slides are really about specific to EPA competitions and how we run them and how you would apply for them. Basically, each solicitation or funding opportunity or announcement, different people refer to the document the same thing, but a solicitation and a funding opportunity announcement are the same thing. But each one has unique requirements and instructions. It's not like you could just read one EPA solicitation and then assume in another one it's going to be the same. It's not. There are some common elements to the solicitations, but they're very different and they're specific because there are different types of projects that are being solicited under each of them. So again, you have to read each one individually. The announcement will indicate who's eligible for awards under it, the deadlines for submission, what you need to include in your application, the evaluation criteria that will be used to evaluate applications, and other information too. Typically, I know no one wants to read a 20 or 25 page document, but in order to get the appropriate information out to applicants, that it has to be in the solicitation. So, again, I wish we could say they were 2 pages long, but we couldn't because we wouldn't be able to get enough meaningful information out for an applicant to prepare a proposal that was then going to be evaluated against other applicants. Some of the language is legalistic, and we understand that, and we're trying to try to streamline it and simplify it. But most of it is pretty straightforward. I'll talk about this later, but if you had questions or didn't understand something in a solicitation, you could call a point of contact for that competition who would try to help you and explain it. As I mentioned, we have a competition policy that governs how we conduct our competitions at EPA. You feel free to look at it whenever you wanna. It's really geared to EPA staff, but again, it does lay out the parameters and governs how we conduct competitions at EPA and the rules that our people have to follow. At EPA, there are several types of solicitations or announcements that we issue. The predominant type is called a request for application. And under a request for application, applicants are asked to submit all of the forms and certifications and the scope of work, or what's called a project narrative, that are needed in order to evaluate the application. So we get everything up front. Again, like I said, this is probably 85 to 90% of our competitions are conducted via an RFA. Typically, the forms, which you can also find at this RAIN, are the SF-24 form, which is the basic application form, the 424A, the 4700-4, which is the civil rights form, a key contacts form, and again, your project narrative, which really is your proposal, or your document that's saying how you're going to perform your project. Some solicitations also request other information like resumes or indirect cost rates. That just depends on the solicitation. But those 5 other documents are generally the bare minimum that are included in each solicitation. Other less common types of solicitations are request for proposals, an RFP. Under that, you kind of get, maybe one grant form and the proposal. And then if you're selected, you would be asked to submit the remainder of the grant forms. We don't really do that much anymore. Typically, that might be used if an office thought they were going to get a voluminous amount of applications and they didn't want everyone to fill out all the forms. And that's the same with the request for initial proposals. That's really a two-phase process. We receive initial proposals to begin with that are short and maybe just the SF-24 form. Those people or entities who score highest on that are then asked to submit more detailed proposals and applications and the remainder of the grant forms that are then evaluated and then selections are made. Again, that's we do that in a very limited number of cases, and it's mostly when an office thinks they're going to get a lot of proposals and they don't want to ask everybody to submit all the grant forms and have to review all that information. So they use one of these approaches, which results in less information up front from applicants, and then they kind of winnow it down based on how well the initial submittals were. All announcements are supposed to be prepared according to the Office of Management and Budget format. That's in Title II of the CFR, which is the Code of Federal Regulations. All government agencies are supposed to follow this format, so there's consistency government-wide. I can't vouch for every agency, but at EPA, we do follow the format pretty literally. And there were typically 8 sections of a solicitation. Section 1, all solicitations will first have like an overview or an introductory section, which just sets out, kind of the basic information about the solicitation, of the deadlines and stuff like that. Section 1 is what's called the program description. That's really the technical or programmatic description of the opportunity. It will describe what types of projects we're interested in getting, what you have to address in your application. I mean, that's really the section of a solicitation that would determine whether you're interested in the opportunity, or even if you're interested, whether you think you have the capability to perform the project. That would really be determined by reviewing and analyzing Section 1 of the solicitation. In Section 2, we really just identify the number of awards we expect to make and how much each award will be. Typically, that's expressed in a range. Some cases we know the exact many awards we're going to make, especially when it's only going to be one. But in most other cases, we usually have a range, depending on, it just depends on various factors, including, how many good proposals we get, the amount of funding we get. So usually there's more of an approximate number of awards that we identify that we're going to make under a solicitation. And excuse me, that's the same with the funding amount. Sometimes we know the exact amount of the awards and we'll put that in there. Other times, again, it's more of a range in the awards. Section 3 of the solicitations is about eligibility information, and that identifies who's eligible to compete for the opportunity. Typically, what that is, it's depending on the assistance listing and CFDA number that applies to it. All of the entities who are eligible under that CFDA number can apply. In some limited cases, we may limit that. For instance, there may be some programs we have where technically individuals can compete, but because of most of our projects really are not feasible for individuals to perform, we wouldn't let them compete. So, we usually would just say, individuals can't compete for this. So, but again, usually it tracks with the CFDA. You obviously have to make sure you're an eligible entity in order to submit an application, because if you're not eligible, and even if you submit the best application, you can't get an award. So if you have any question whether you're eligible, contact the point of contact for the solicitation before you invest time and resources in preparing a proposal for an award that you can't get under any circumstances. Section 3 will also identify whether there's any cost share or matching requirements that apply to the award. And in short, what that is that for some of our programs, if you get an award, you have to contribute a certain amount of money. For instance, if there's like a 10% cost share and you get $100 from EPA, you have to contribute $10. That would be identified in the solicitation. In addition, almost every one of our solicitations have what's called threshold eligibility criteria. And these are really yes, no, or pass, fail criteria that all applications must meet in order to even be scored. These are like, there might be things, well, obviously one is, you have to have your proposal submitted on time. And if it's late, barring unforeseen circumstances, we don't accept late proposals. There are other things where certain, for instance, in some of our competitions, the projects have to be performed in a certain geographic area. If they're not, then we won't review you. And there are other types of threshold eligibility criteria also in solicitations. And so that's really, Section 3 is really important because, again, it determines whether you're eligible, and then it sets forth the, bare minimum or the threshold factors that every application has to meet in order to even be scored. And if you don't meet those threshold factors and you get rejected, what will happen is, and I think we'll discuss this later, but just in short now, you would get a notice from EPA that your application did not pass the threshold eligibility review. You would have the opportunity to ask for what's called a debriefing, which is if you wanted to get further information about why you were rejected or you wanted to learn more, you could ask for a debriefing. After that debriefing or during the debriefing, if you think we made a mistake or something, you could raise that. If we do make a mistake, then we'll let you back in the competition. I mean, we're not perfect, and if sometimes errors are made, and if that is pointed out and that's correct, then we'll put you back in the competition. If you're rejected and you just disagree with that determination, you have the ability to file what's called a dispute with EPA, and that's really a process where you would set forth why you think we were wrong. We have a dispute official who would decide that. They would either agree with you or agree with EPA. If they agreed with you, then you would be put back in the competition. If not, then that's pretty much the final say on it. To be very honest with you, we do not get many disputes, which is a good thing. We have this process that's probably unique in the government where we have this ability for debriefings and an ability to correct mistakes, but we've been very fortunate, and I think I think when they do have debriefings, and there's only so much you could put on an email and paper, but when you then have an opportunity to discuss the reasons why we may have rejected you, most people are satisfied with the explanation, and it's resulted in very few disputes that we've gotten at EPA.
Bruce,
yeah.
We are about halfway through on time on the webinar. I know we got a little bit of a late start due to our technical difficulties, but if it's possible at all to pick up the pace a little on the presentation, just so we have time to do the second presentation, that would be good. Okay.
I'll try. I'm from New York, so I'll try and talk faster now. Section 4 of the solicitation just identifies what information we want in the application. It will describe the content of the information. It will describe how you apply through grants.gov. There's a whole set of instructions. It will set forth the submission dates and times. Typically, each of our solicitations open for at least 45 calendar days, some a little more, some a little less. It will also indicate that there are page limits for solicitations, or at least most of them. The two main things to remember here is pay attention to the deadline. If you're late, you're late. And again, unless it's something unforeseen or something that's really some act of God that caused it, we don't accept late applications because that's not fair to the applicants who did submit it on time. Same thing with page limits. There's a page limit pretty much in every solicitation for the proposal. If you exceed that, we don't read the extra pages. We won't reject you, but we just won't read the pages in excess of it. And that could be a competitive disadvantage to you because if you have a lot of information in those pages, we're not going to look at it. So please pay careful attention to that. We also have a provisions in each of our solicitations, which are just a link that then goes to certain boilerplate provisions that are included in every solicitation. The next few slides just go over that. This is the page with them. We did this mainly because it was able to cut out 10 pages from the solicitation. And these are clauses, again, that go in every single solicitation. So we just established a page to house these clauses. And again, this is just a table of contents of some of them. I don't want to go over them all now, but they are important. The contract and subawards one is technical, but it's important. It kind of explains how we'll evaluate you if you propose any contractors that are going to assist you with your project. And again, all of those clauses are on the internet. You could read them anytime you want. And if you had questions about any of them, feel free to ask Liz or myself. We could try to help you with them and understand them if you didn't understand what the clauses meant. Section 5 of the solicitation really identifies the evaluation criteria that's used to score the applications. Every solicitation has, a whole set of criteria. Many are common to all of our solicitations, but each solicitation also has unique criteria. Here are just a list of some that are pretty much in each solicitation. Programmatic capability, that really looks at your resources and experience to perform the grant. Past performance is how well you performed under prior grants. The typical issue there is, what if I'm a new applicant or I don't have prior grants? How do you evaluate me? Well, the answer is we really just give you half the points for that criteria. That's really what we have found is the fairest way to do that. Environmental results is really just how your project is going to result in environmental outcomes. Timely expenditure of grant funds is just, if you're going to get the grant, do you have a plan for expeditiously spending the money we give you? Technical approach is just that. It's really just your technical approach to performing the projects that we're soliciting. And budget and leveraging. Leveraging is just a concept that's in some solicitations where we evaluate whether you have other resources or other grants that you're performing that, when combined with the EPA grant that you might get, will get a bigger bang for the buck. So those are just typical evaluation factors. In addition, in pretty much every one of our solicitations, we have a list of other factors, which are non-point scored factors that we may consider in making selection decisions. And those really only come into play if there's a close scoring between some applications where 1 or 2 points differentiate them, and there may be a reason why we should take the 1 or 2 point lower scored one over the higher one. So we have that ability to do that. But again, we disclose all of this in solicitations. There's nothing undisclosed about what we do. And again, there's additional provisions. Again, these are the boilerplate provisions. There are boilerplate provisions that apply to different sections of the solicitation. So that's why you'll see it a couple times. Section 6 of solicitations is really just administrative information. The main thing here is the dispute process, which I mentioned earlier. In addition to, if you failed the threshold factors, then you could get a debriefing and file a dispute if you were unhappy. If you get scored and you think that you don't get an award and you think we screwed up your score and you should have got higher, in some limited cases you could file a dispute after a debriefing. Again, it's not, if this is just a case where you disagree with our score, that's not going to be enough. You'd have to show that somehow we misscored you or we ignored information that you submitted. But again, we get very few disputes, and I think that's a testament to the process we have and the debriefings that we do. And again, this is just a list of the boilerplate clauses that are all included in solicitations. And again, for the sake of time, if you look at these and have questions about them, because again, some are written legalistically, feel free to call me and Liz and we'll go over them with you. Section 7 is just list the point of contact if you have any questions about the solicitation. And Section 8 is just for miscellaneous information. Excuse me. Typically, sometimes we have to modify an announcement by, because we have to extend the due date. If we do that, that will be posted on grants.gov. And that's another reason why when you are on grants.gov and you're interested in an EPA opportunity, you could sign up to get automatic notification if we make any modifications to that opportunity. And I strongly encourage you to do that, because if you're interested in something, it has a due date, and then we change that due date to make it later, and you're not aware of that, you may rush to get your proposal in without realizing you have another 3 weeks. So again, we encourage you to sign up to get notifications if we modify any of our solicitations. And communications with applicants, that comes up a lot because during a competition, sometimes applicants want to contact us with questions about it. And because we're conducting a competition and have to be fair to everybody, there are limitations of what we can and cannot discuss. Many programs, when they do a competition, they'll have a question and answer website and the ability for applicants to submit questions, which are then posted. Some do webinars where, they'll set a webinar up and everybody can attend prior to the due date to go over the solicitation and ask any questions. Typically, all of this information and the logistics for it are identified in sections 4 or 7 of the announcement. During a competition, there are some things that we can do and will help with. If you're uncertain whether you're eligible, ask us. As I said earlier, the last thing we want is for you to spend a lot of time on resources preparing a proposal for something that you're ineligible for. If there are administrative aspects of the submission or the process that you're unclear about, feel free to call the point of contact. Certain things we can't do is we can't write application for you or review it. And in short, we can't provide any one applicant information that we don't provide to everybody. We try to do these as fair and have everybody on the same playing field as possible. This next slide, again, this just kind of summarizes the whole process of what I mentioned earlier. The only thing here to note is prior to someone getting an award, we check what's called as FAPIS, which is a government-wide system that houses information about an applicant. In some cases, if there's negative information about an applicant, that may be factored into whether they get an award or not. And this is just some points of contact in the competition office. Again, if you have any questions, you could feel free to contact me or Liz or anybody. So with that, I appreciate your time, and if you have any questions, we'll try to answer as many as you can.
Thank you, Bruce. Just a reminder to everybody, if you do have questions, please use the link at the bottom of the slide. It should open up a form for you to just type in your question. The chat pane, unfortunately, is not very user-friendly for questions and answers of this type. So if you put your question in the form, we do have it. We will do our best to answer it and put the response in the chat. If you miss it in the chat or we don't get to your question, we are going to be compiling all of these questions into a Q&A document that we will post on the webinar page. So you don't have to worry about missing your answer, and you can always reach out to me directly if you have questions that you're unable to receive a response to, or maybe it's not appropriate for the webinar and it's a very specific question. You can reach out directly to me. I'm going to work on getting up our next presentation. If you'll bear with me. And again, just a reminder, I'm seeing some questions go into the chat. Please put them in the forms Q&A. Your question may be answered. We are doing our best to capture the questions in the chat, but I don't want to miss any of them. So please put them in the form if you can. Okay, we're going to move on to our next presentation. This is just an overview of grants management. If you are selected for a grant, what to expect. I'm going to go over some of the information Bruce has already gone over as it relates to this presentation. He already mentioned grants.gov, great resource. Please use it to look for current opportunities. And that goes hand in hand with sam.gov, which is where you need to start your registration process if you want to apply for government assistance. You start with sam.gov and then you can register in grants.gov, and your SAM registration connects with your grants.gov registration. Okay, so once you are preparing to apply for an EPA grant, these are just some things that to keep in mind. Even if it's not an EPA grant, any federal agency you're interested in applying to, you should learn a little bit about them, what kind of work they usually fund. If there's a specific opportunity you're interested in, read it thoroughly. Bruce just took us through lots of information so you can see how detailed these documents can be. So you should read the entire thing. We don't put anything in there that isn't important. And then the next step is to research and complete your application, which sounds nice and easy when it's up there on the screen in one bullet. So some questions to ask yourself as you're perusing grants.gov for opportunities. Do you have enough time to complete your proposal? The opportunities at EPA are open for a minimum of 45 days, but if you happen upon it halfway through that open period, you're going to have to assess, do I really have enough time to complete my entire application? And that's why it's important to register for grants.gov in advance, because it can take several weeks for that process. And if you're happening upon an opportunity with only 2 weeks left until your application needs to be in and you haven't started your grants.gov registration, that likely will lead to you not being able to submit your application in time. You should also think about whether your organization has the capability to do the work that you would be proposing under that announcement. And are the budget and resource requirements appropriate? For example, if the opportunity requires a match, which is the amount the recipient must provide to match the federal funds, you'll need to determine whether you will be capable of providing that match, either yourself or through in-kind arrangements. And are your partners and stakeholders on board and available? You may want to partner with these organizations and submit your proposal based around those partnerships. And then when it comes time to make the award, find out they're not really interested. So do that homework up front so you don't find yourself in that situation. When you're developing your project, Bruce already told us that there's lots of information in the request for application document, and that is definitely the #1 resource for you when applying or when preparing your proposal. However, there are just some general things that you can frame your proposal around, but disclaimer, always follow what's in the RFA. You want to think about your problem statement. What problem are you solving? That should be really clear. What are your goals in solving that problem? What activities are you going to include that will help you achieve those goals? You're also going to need to address project design and methodology. These things will be evaluated in Section 5 of the solicitation, so they're important to include and think about. Any key personnel and staffing that might be essential for your project to succeed. You also need to think about budget and how you're going to evaluate your project, the progress of your project as you move along. Your problem statement should be well supported, clear, concise. The importance of it being clear and concise, I cannot stress enough. We have reviewers that are going to be reviewing potentially hundreds of applications. You want it to be easy for them to know what this application is about. You should specify how your problem will be solved through the requested funding, and if there's any relevant or recent work that you've completed or recent successes, you'll want to include those as well. Bruce mentioned outcomes earlier, which are usually explained in Section 1 of the solicitation. We also talk about them in our environmental results order, and the link is up on the slide for you to click on and bookmark for later. It's a really good read. I recommend it. And it's all about how EPA ensures environmental results through partially through its grant funding. So outcomes are very important to address in your solicitation, and they will be evaluated. Also, you need to establish procedures that are needed to measure your outcomes. It's great to have a goal, but you need to have a way to measure how you're going to get there or whether you're getting there or not. And you'll include project evaluation as part of that and process evaluation. Okay, your budget. This is a big piece of your proposal. It can be really complicated depending on what kinds of things that you're looking for funding for. But the most basic thing to remember is that your budget should be a monetary description of the project that you described in your work plan. It should be really clear the connection between the work you're describing and the types of things you're asking for funds for. For example, if you have a project where you're training a bunch of people on environmental issues, and then you have rental for a boat in your budget, and it's not clear, what are you doing with that boat? What does this have to do with your education plan? It may be connected. You may be taking participants out on a boat and showing them how to sample water. But if it's not clear in your work plan, then that's going to be something that's questioned in your budget and make it seem like, you know, this may not be a well thought out project. So remember, you always need to make sure everything in your budget can be traced back to something in your narrative work plan. You also need to make sure that you're requesting the costs you need to complete the project. If you know you're going to need a certain amount and you're asking for a lot less, that is going to be a difficult project to be successful at. All of the costs included, including your match and cost share, have to meet the cost principles, which are in 2 CFR 200 subpart E, and that link should take you there. They did just change the electronic CFR. So if for some reason that link doesn't work for you, please let us know. We also have budget guidance, pretty extensive budget guidance that includes a budget sample in that RAIN 2019 GO2 up on the screen. So please check that out. We usually reference it in most of our competitive solicitations, but it's a really good thing to have handy anyway. So I would bookmark it. You also need to address program income. This is income earned as a direct result of grant-supported activities. It's important you address it up front, not because it's a problem or an issue. It's more that we have to know that you are including program income so we can help determine how to address that program income. There are certain decisions that need to be made prior to award on what to do with that program income. Approach procedures and controls for ensuring that the awarded grant funds will be expended in a timely and efficient manner. Bruce mentioned this in his presentation about criteria that you'll be evaluated against. So this is an important thing to make sure you address. I'm going to go over some of the categories in the budget. These are also included in our budget training that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, well, the beginning of the webinar actually, and also we have that budget guidance that I linked to in a prior slide, but this is going to give you an overview of all of that. So the first category in direct costs, now you have direct costs and indirect costs. The first category in indirect costs I'm going to go over is personnel. And so this is direct costs for any salaries, wages, and allowable incentive compensation for your employees, your organization's employees. So this wouldn't include volunteers or people, your participants in your program. This is just the people that receive W-2 forms in your organization. You would not include consulting costs. Or really any costs for people who are not your employees. And if no personnel costs are listed, that's a red flag usually, and EPA will ask for an explanation on how the award will be managed. If you don't have any personnel costs on this, how are you making sure that the award activities are getting done, and what kind of oversight are you having over that award? Fringe benefits goes hand in hand with the personnel costs. They're allowances and services provided by employers to their employees in addition to salaries and wages. So we're talking about leave, employee insurance, pensions, unemployment, if you have a company cell phone, that kind of thing. Now this is usually a rate called a fringe rate that is against your personnel costs. If you don't have a rate, you will have to provide an estimate and an explanation for how you calculated that fringe. Travel is another direct cost. Again, this is only for your employees, so only those people filling out a W-2. And you should only include trips that are necessary to perform the EPA agreement. And again, this doesn't include travel for trainees, interns, fellows, work group members, transportation services like a bus and a driver. That wouldn't go here. That would go in contractual. Van rentals for local transportation. But you should include transportation fares, lodging, per diem. So that's the money you get to spend on food and other sundries when you're traveling. Any rental vehicles, taxes that are associated with travel, like hotel tax, internet access charges that you might incur, say, in a hotel room, and phone calls that are completed in, say, a hotel room or payphone, if those still exist. Okay, equipment. This is another direct cost. And equipment is tangible, non-expendable personal property that has a useful life of more than a year and an acquisition cost of $5,000 or more. So your laptop is probably not considered equipment unless it's a really fancy laptop. And it doesn't include equipment rentals. It does include accessories or services that are included with the purchase of equipment. So if you buy a copier and it includes a service agreement, then you can put that in here. But if the service agreement is entered into outside of the purchase of the equipment, then you would not include it in here. You should include an itemized list of any equipment that you know you're going to need in your budget, because equipment needs prior approval. And so including it in your budget and making that award is given to you, that is approval. That's EPA saying we approve of what's in this budget. If you want to buy any equipment that is not itemized in your budget or your work plan, then you are going to need to seek approval. Direct cost supplies. So this is basically anything that doesn't fit in the equipment category. So tangible personal property other than equipment with a per item acquisition cost of less than $5,000. Now there is an exception here if your organization's written property management policies are based on a lower dollar threshold. So if your own organization's policies say no, supplies are $1,000 or under, anything over is equipment, you would follow your own policy. This includes laptops, personal computers, tablets, and cell phones. Contracts. Now, this is a bit of a tricky one. I think Bruce alluded to some clauses that we have on subawards and contracts. So this is something that you may not get all the information you need from this presentation. So procurement contracts are when you acquire property and services to carry out the EPA funded project. Now it has its own category in the budget, and it includes consultants and contractual services. And just a note, consultant fees are capped. And that actually might be the wrong citation now that I'm looking at it. But they are capped. There's a particular rate and you can't go above that. This would also include speaker fees, honoraria. If you have non-employees traveling, this is where you'd include that travel cost. Standalone contracts would also go in here. Does not include facility rentals. And really important, do not identify your contractors in competitive proposals. And we do talk about this in the solicitation itself. We have a whole clause that goes into it. And the reason for that is if you identify those contractors and then we find out, or it comes to light that you have not followed proper procurement procedures, then those contracts have to be recompeted. And that could jeopardize your proposal, because if it was selected with the understanding that that contractor was going to be doing some of the work, and perhaps that's why you got such a good score, if that contractor has to be taken out of it, then that could impact your score and potentially your selection. So it's really important not to identify your contractors. Even if you think you follow in procurement regulations, it's just easier to not include them. Safer. Oh, and construction. You probably won't have to deal with this. We don't really have construction in many competitive, well, we don't have a lot of it at all at EPA, and certainly not in competition or competitive programs. But just so you're aware of what it is, and it will show up on your budget worksheet. Construction includes the erection, alteration, or repair of buildings, structures, or other improvements to real property, and activities in response to release or threat of release of hazardous substance in the environment, or activities to prevent the introduction of hazardous substance into a water supply. Again, typically not found in competitive programs. Okay, the last direct cost category is other. It's So this is truly this is the one where everything else goes into if it doesn't fit in the first categories. Examples of other, there can be a lot of different things in here, but just some examples: insurance, indemnification, telephone services and utilities, especially if they're not included in your indirect, occasional document reproduction, a copy centers, third-party and kind contributions toward cost share. So if you have organizations that are donating their time or services, this is where you would include the valuation of that for your cost share. Tuition remission, scholarships, rental lease of equipment, so you don't put that in equipment, you put that here. Rental and lease of office space and conference facilities. Also participant support costs, which can include stipends and travel costs for your participants, and subawards. Subawards are different from contracts, and we have a subaward policy that goes into a lot of detail about how to determine that, and we don't have enough time for me to get into it in this presentation, but we do have more information on it. Indirect costs is the other big category. So these costs include costs that are incurred for common or joint purpose that benefit more than one cost objective or project, and they're not readily assignable to specific cost objectives or projects as a direct cost. So this is basically overhead. So you can budget for indirect costs pending an indirect cost rate approval. So if you don't have a rate and you apply for one, or an exception from EPA where you can't draw down until the indirect cost rate is approved or an exception is granted. That being said, you do have a 10%, what's called the 10% de minimis rate at your disposal. So if you don't have a rate and you're not interested in getting one, but you still want to charge indirect, because every organization has indirect whether they have a rate or not, you can charge the 10% de minimis rate. We do have an extensive policy on indirect costs and also guidance, Q&As, and a great training that takes you through this somewhat complicated topic. Also, 2 CFR 200-414 has indirect cost information if you want to go straight to the regs, but I should warn you, they are not easily decipherable, hence the policy we came out with and extensive guidance and training. So when you get selected for an award under a competitive program, you're not really going to have much room to negotiate. And that's actually to protect the openness of our competitions. If we allowed selected competitive applicants to change their work plans after the fact, that would be really unfair to all the applicants that prepared their work plans and didn't get selected, but maybe would have appreciated an opportunity to revise them. So we don't really revise them other than deliverable dates, timelines, that kind of thing that usually are necessary to adjust once we're actually ready to make the award. For non-competitive awards, the negotiation process can be much more extensive. It's a give and take negotiation of all aspects of the award, and that can include scope of work, funding levels, inclusion of milestones, budget, terms and conditions. But for competitive awards, you won't get into much of that at all. If you are a nonprofit and you are getting over a certain dollar threshold of federal funds, you may have to undergo what's called a nonprofit awardee assessment. The reason I include this in this presentation, which is, for every type of applicant, is that even though we just apply this to nonprofits, these requirements are requirements for all types of applicants, not just nonprofits. So it's good to highlight that these are things you should be aware of. So just some basics: your funds, your federal funds that you receive under your grant should be deposited in a separate account. You should have written accounting procedures to manage that money. You should have an accounting system that allows you to separately track all the expenditures and drawdowns against the budget. You should have an inventory system in place for your equipment and supplies, procurement procedures that comply with the regulations, codes of conduct, and you also need to have record retention that complies with EPA regulations. If you are selected, you will receive a notice of award. This is different from your selection letter that says, "Congratulations, we've selected your proposal." That is not an award. That is just saying, "Hey, we selected you and now you're going for the next round of review." And that's really where you undergo your administrative review to make sure everything is in compliance with the regulations and any other requirements that EPA has to ensure are complied with. Once that process is done, you will get a notice of award. Now, this is a document that's prepared and signed by the Grants Management Office, and it certifies that the award complies with all legal, regulatory, and internal policy requirements, and that it's a sound business agreement into which EPA should enter. This document legally obligates federal funds. Now, your notice of award may be overwhelming because it can be long, especially with all the terms and conditions, but it's important that you read it carefully. It has lots of important information in it. And as I'll mention later, you really should do it right away, because if there's anything wrong, you need to let us know. It'll have your grant number, and that is the way we identify everything to do with that grant. So if you have any communication, if there's any correspondence at all, that grant number should be on it. It'll have your organization name, the name of the principal investigator, the main recipient point of contact on that particular agreement, the project period and budget period start and end dates for that project, the amount of federal funds authorized for obligation by the recipient, and very importantly, any matching or cost sharing. And the reason I say very importantly is if you accept that document and it has match on there, you are legally agreeing to provide that match. And you are required to apply provide it after you have accepted that agreement. So it's really important to make sure those numbers are correct. The notice of award will also include programmatic and financial reporting requirements. It will include important contacts, your project officer, your grants management officer, and your grants management specialist or grant specialist. These people are people you should be familiar with and get to know on a professional basis, of course. You should have their email handy, their phone numbers. They should be the people you reach out to with any questions or concerns or potential issues that come up. They want you to succeed. So make sure you're in direct communication with them as often as necessary. You'll also have applicable terms and conditions of award, and this is either by reference or inclusion. And what I mean by that is inclusion, they're right in there for you to read. By reference means it might just reference a law, a regulation, some other document where it's not actually written out in the agreement. So it's important, if you don't understand any of these terms and conditions, that you contact your EPA point of contact on the grant agreement and ask them for information. It'll also include your payment procedures, so how you get your drawdown from EPA to pay your bills associated with the grant award. Now, this award, long time ago used to have to sign it. We don't do that anymore. The way you agree to the terms of the award is one of two ways. One way is drawing down money. So if you get the award and you go right to drawing down funds without reading it, well, you've just accepted the award. So hopefully there's no issues in there. I don't recommend that. You should read the whole thing, make sure you don't have any questions, and then draw down the funds if you don't have any questions. The other way is to not do anything for 21 days. So if you sit on that grant, you don't draw down any money, but you also don't tell EPA that there's a problem, if 21 calendar days pass, you have now accepted that award. So if you just let it sit in your inbox and don't look at it, you still will accept it. So please don't do that. It can be complicated and long, so read it as soon as possible. Now, once you have that grant award, you are going to be responsible for managing all of it. EPA is not going to be your babysitter. We're not going to necessarily be checking in and saying, hey, don't forget you have that report due. So it's really important that you take responsibility for all the things that you're required to do under that grant agreement. You also should use any established controls and policies that are in place as long as they're consistent with award requirements and EPA regulations. You should ensure completion of and timely completion of program progress reports, financial reports, audits, reports associated with those, and then any correspondence. Any requirements should be detailed in your terms and conditions and what the reporting due dates are. So please read that, make sure you don't have any questions about it. Also, you are responsible for identifying any potential problems or areas where technical assistance might be necessary. Earlier, I mentioned how EPA staff are there to help you. Well, if you ever think there might be a problem or you think you might need some technical assistance, please reach out to EPA. We want you to be successful. We will do what we can to support you. Now, if we don't find out about the problem until it's too late for us to support you, that can be a problem. So earlier is better. I wanted to make sure you're aware of the OMB Uniform Grants Guidance, or also referred to as the Omni Circular. This replaced a whole slew of regs and OMB circulars we had years ago, but now everything is located at 2 CFR 200 for the federal government, and then EPA has some specific regulations at 2 CFR 1500. Normally at the end of the webinar, I take people through the ECFR because it can be a little bit daunting for people who haven't ever navigated it. And I have some tricks and tips that I like to share with people to make it a little less overwhelming. But our webinar is going longer than usual, so I may not have time to do that. But I promise you, I will make sure there's time on the next webinar. So if you attend our next one in December, it will likely be in December, then I will go over the ECFR in that one. The cost principles are also located in the CFR. They're in 2 CFR 200, but they're in subpart E, and there's a link to it. And this applies to any funding awarded on or after December 26, 2014. Probably none of you have any grants hanging around from before that time. But if you do, your terms and conditions will determine they'll tell you what cost principles you should be following, whether you should be following the ones prior to December 26, 2014, or the ones that started on December 26, 2014. And of course, if you have any questions about that, you can reach out to your grant specialist or your project officer. I want to make sure you're aware of our recipient applicant information notices. Now, we call these RAINs for short, and basically there are any new guidance that we put out, any new resources like training, important changes and other information, and we have them all on our policy resource page, which looks like this. And there's a table that's filterable. You can type whatever you want in the search box, indirect costs, for example. And that will come up with the policy or the RAINs or any other documentation we have available to you relating to indirect costs. So I'll just go back a slide so you can get that link and then play around with that table later, because it is really nifty and it's easy to find information. You know, if you need help with budget, just type in budget. You'll see all sorts of resources. And we also send these RAINs out in our listserv that I plugged earlier. So anytime we put out a new one, we send out a notification through our listserv, and that way you know it's there and you don't have to check the page periodically. You'll just know when a new RAIN comes out. We also have the training. I mentioned this at the very beginning of the webinar, but I know some people weren't able to access the webinar at that time, so I'll briefly go over it again. This is training that we have that takes you through the entire grant life cycle, and whether or not you've had a grant at EPA before, it's a really great training, and you know, you may learn some things you didn't know even if you're a seasoned grant recipient. So I really encourage you to take the training. It's split up into 6 modules. I don't think any of them take more than an hour to go through, and you can take them separately on your own time, and they have quizzes and knowledge checks that can help make sure you're retaining the information, and I really highly recommend it. We also have a budget training, how to develop a budget. You saw how detailed budgets can get, and I barely touched the tip of the iceberg in this presentation. So I recommend taking this training. It'll give you a good overview of all the different things that are involved in developing a budget and the different costs to be aware of and how to categorize them and properly document them. I mentioned the listserv. I promised I'd have another link up later in the webinar. Here it is. You can click on that link. It'll take you to a form, and that form should allow you to sign up for the listserv. You just have to put your email and name in there. I don't even know if you have to put your name in there, maybe just your email. And then you'll be added to our listserv, and you'll get notified of new things, including our next webinar date, which should be in about 3 months. These are some handy resources. It's not everything I went over and Bruce went over today, but it's a nice list all in one place. You know, it includes our RAIN page. It includes some specific EPA grant programs, the ECFR that I talked about earlier, sam.gov. So this is just a really handy page to have, and the presentation's downloadable from our website, which I think we already mentioned. So you can grab it from there if you don't have enough time to click all the links. These are some contacts related to grants management. You can reach out to Larice Jones, Keisha Holiday, or myself, Elizabeth January, and we can try to answer any questions that you think you have about what we presented today, or even just outside of that. And even if we're not the right people to answer your question, we will help you find the right person. I'm sticking the form link back up there for those of you who may need it handy while we wait for the last of the questions to come in. And I'm gonna check to see if we have any to read out loud for the group. I know you guys have been great sending them in. Whoa, we have a lot that have been going on while I've been doing my presentation.
I know, Liz, we have, I mean, I looked, we do have a lot. We probably won't get to them all, but I don't know.
Right, so I'll read a few of them out loud, and we'll try to respond to them. Now, some of these I'm not going to read out loud because I think they're more of a specific question. Okay, so here's one question. What are the requirements for applying for a phase 2 of funding? Now, those don't happen very frequently. My understanding is right now, I think the only competitions we have that do that are under the Office of Research and Development, ORD, and they are very explicit about how the phase 2 of funding works in that solicitation. So the first phase will be competitive and they do their evaluation and it's all explained in the solicitation document, but they also explain how phase 2 works. And there is usually a second set of criteria that's applied to the phase 2. But it really depends on that particular program and how they're handling it. There isn't one way to do it. So I'm sorry I can't give you a more specific answer, but if you're thinking of a specific grant program that you have questions about, the phase 2 aspect of it, please reach out to the point of contact listed for that program because they're going to be able to give you more specific information.
And Liz, they also may be asking about the RFIP approach when they say phase 2, not the ORD. So if that's the question about what I was mentioning of the RFIP type of competition where the initial proposals come in and then they winnow it down and ask for them again. I mean, that process is just, there's really 2 evaluations. There's an evaluation of the sort of the phase 1 brief applications, and then those who score higher and submit more detailed, there'll be a second evaluation of what we might be referring to as phase 2.
Yeah, and so they also will detail all of that information in the RFA itself, and it will vary from program to program how exactly they do that. But they are very rare. We don't do many RFIPs anymore. So if you do find one, though, look in the section 5. We'll talk about how they're evaluated in the two different submissions.
Hey, Liz, one question I know, just will take a second. No, a fiscal agent cannot apply for you. I saw that, and that's come up before. The organization that applies for grants.gov, you have to apply. It has to be, you're the AOR, your DUNS number.
So it's a little bit more complex than that. Bruce is right that you have to, an AOR, an authorized organizational representative that's assigned to your particular organization in grants.gov, and it's your, I'm going to throw out some terms that people may not be familiar with, and I apologize. Your eBiz point of contact, who's the person identified in your SAM.gov registration, that person in grants.gov and your grants.gov registration can assign who your authorized organizational representatives are. And the person hitting the submit button in grants.gov has to be an authorized organizational representative for your particular organization. Now, you can authorize people that are outside of your organization to submit on your behalf, but you have to make sure that you've authorized them and that they're applying under the correct DUNS number or eventually UEI number. So you can work with consultants, you can work with fiscal agents, but the way it's submitted through grants.gov, it must be done under your organization's DUNS number and by an AOR for your organization. If you are ever not sure about whether you're doing it correctly, please contact us or grants.gov's help desk. But for this particular one, I would contact the point of contact in the RFA and say, hey, I want to make sure I'm submitting this application correctly. You know, can I have help to make sure I'm doing it properly? Oh, we have a question. I thought office rent was an indirect cost. Yes, it can be an indirect cost. It also can be a direct cost. It depends on how your particular indirect is, how your rate was developed. So it depends. But we use it as another example for those organizations that don't have indirect, or their indirect may not include it. But that's a great thing to point out. Thank you. What is the EPA internal process of reviewing grant applications? So that's a big question. We may not have enough time to cover all of it, but I will include it in the FAQ so we can, you know, give you as much detail as we can. But I will say that the RFA usually or should really explain how the review process will go. You'll find that in section 5 after all the criteria. There'll be a section where they talk about review and selection, and they'll explain, you know, whether panels will be reviewing it, whether there'll be EPA panels, or whether they'll include external organizations. They'll talk about the type of review being done usually, but it varies how they actually do the review. But what doesn't vary is they always use the criteria in the solicitation. There are no undisclosed criteria, so you always know how you're being evaluated. But we will work on answering this question more in depth in the FAQ.
And just to add a little to that quickly, as listed, generally there'll be a review panel of panels. They'll score the applications and they submit the recommendations to what's called a selection official in a program office who makes the final call. As we said, usually it's just based on the scoring, but sometimes there's ability to go out of order to pick a lower scored one if it meets some policy objectives better. But again, that's just a very brief summary of it. The RFA would be more detailed about that.
We have a question that I think is referring to a specific RFA, and I believe it might be the environmental education RFA actually. The question is it true that only $300,000 is available for Region 5? So your solicitation that you're looking at, the request for applications, will say how much is available in section 2 of the document. And yes, what they have in there is what they have available. It is sometimes it's possible that more funding becomes available, and we have a clause for that and how programs are allowed to deal with it, because we don't want them to get funding a year later and use the same solicitation because it might be stale and new people might want an opportunity to apply. But if it's been only a little bit of time, they can maybe move down the selection list and give some more awards. But as of right now, my understanding is for the environmental ed program, there's only $300,000 available for each region. But again, the RFA is the best source of information for that. Oh, just checking time. We're a little past 3:30, and you've all been so patient with us. I know there's a few more questions to answer. I think I'm going to just highlight some of the questions I've already answered in chat because I think they were good questions. One was, how do I sign up for grants.gov? And the best place to go is grants.gov. They have a website called Applicant and Organization Registration, which lists the steps on how to do that. And also, if you're struggling at all with registration, and I cannot emphasize this enough, don't wait until you're beating your head against a wall and the deadline is breathing down your neck. Call their customer service. And if you're ever having trouble with the customer service and not getting the help you need, reach out to your contacts at EPA. We like to know when that stuff isn't working, and we can directly work with grants.gov to try to correct some of those issues, but always start with the grants.gov support first. And I'm sorry, I see that there have been a couple questions that have come up, but I can't see the chat. I don't have the ability to see the chat. So I'm going to go on to one other question. This is another good one. If we apply by December 2021 and the DUNS changes in April 2022 when our projects haven't started yet, will they update automatically? That's a great question. I don't have an answer for you right now. EPA will be providing information when we have more information on how EPA is transitioning from DUNS to UEI. Please sign up for the listserv. If you're not already, you'll get notified. But I will say it won't be like, oh, you didn't know to do this, so you're out. It won't be like that. We will make sure that you have all the information you need. And I imagine we're going to try to make it so we do whatever we can to keep the burden off of the applicants and recipients from having to manage the transition. But we will provide more information when we have it. We're just not equipped right now to handle the UEI, so that's why there's no information out there. But we're working on it, and we're hoping that we'll have some updates for you soon. And another great question that's really prescient is it required to include or serve underserved communities? So this is definitely a hot topic right now, and EPA is doing a lot to incorporate underserved communities and supporting underserved communities in their grant programs. But the specifics of each grant program's requirements are going to be in the solicitation itself. And so every program is incorporating how to best support underserved communities differently depending on their statutory authority and what they're allowed to fund. You know, EPA has actually a lot of restrictions on what types of work we're allowed to fund. So it's really going to vary from program to program. So if you're interested in that, I would read the solicitations when they come out, see what you're seeing in terms of underserved communities and how the program is addressing it. But it will differ from program to program.
And just to add a little, Liz is 100% right on that. And I think the only other thing to add is it's probably fair to say there's going to be more and more solicitations that focus on it going forward, but I don't think every single solicitation is going to have to address it because, as Liz said, the subject matter just may not be relevant to that particular one, may not be relevant for underserved communities, but I think you're going to see more and more that do have an underserved community element, but not 100% of them.
We have another question. This question is about grant eligibility. They're asking for information on eligibility and who to contact. So this is a bit of a complicated answer. If you have an opportunity you're interested in that's already out there and you're not sure whether you're eligible, you should definitely reach out to the point of contact listed in that opportunity. But I have a feeling you're asking just in general, not specific to an opportunity. And that's why it's a tricky question to answer, because it's really going to depend on which program you're applying for, because eligibility requirements vary widely, and that's somewhat due to the statutory requirements that each program has to adhere to. So if you want to reach out to me directly, I can try to work with you to figure out who you should talk to at EPA about your particular eligibility questions. There might be a program contact I can get you in touch with. So please just reach out directly to me and I will help hook you up with the right person.
And we know a lot of you, maybe following the news and know, the infrastructure bill and all the activity in Congress and a lot of emphasis on environmental programs and climate change. And if you've read some of the proposals, there's a lot of money being targeted to EPA. I mean, none of that's final, none of it's passed, but if it does materialize, there will be a lot more competitions for grant funds this year and probably next year. Again, it depends on what Congress ultimately does, but that the proposals are for a lot of increased funding for EPA.
Thank you, Bruce. So I haven't seen any new questions go in. I know I didn't get to everybody's question. So like I said, we're going to be answering each of these questions in an FQ, and we will post it directly to that webinar page that how you got here to begin with, how you registered, and hopefully maybe one of our facilitators can pop that link into the chat so everyone can bookmark it. But once the FQ is up and the recording is up of this presentation, we will send out a listserv link. So don't feel like you have to keep checking the website As long as you're signed up to the listserv, you'll find out, and then you'll be able to look at the FQ. And if for some reason your question isn't answered or you have more questions, you'll be able to reach out to us. I really appreciate all of you hanging on through our technical difficulties. This is, again, our first time using this platform. And I think we have a few kinks to work out, but we appreciate your patience. And Bruce Binder, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise on competition with everyone. And we will be reaching out via the listserv with all the information I already mentioned, but also our next webinar, when we have it scheduled, we'll announce it. And like I said, we'll try to do more content next time, where I'll take you through the ECFR. It's helped a lot of people, and so I recommend tuning in for the next webinar for that. Thank you all.